Our next speakers, I guess plural, are both from USC, Dennis Deapen and Jung Lee. They're essentially population scientists looking at the prevalence of gastric cancer and the ethnic representation of these groups, and so they will be, I think, speaking in tandem correctly of ethnic and racial differences in gastric cancer incidence in the United States. So please welcome Dennis and Jung. Thank you for coming.
I want to thank Dr. Wang for infecting Dr. Lee and myself with a passion for translating our population data into action and prevention, at least prevention of late diagnosis and death. We manage the SEER registry for Los Angeles County. And so when you're seeing the SEER data presented here, I would guess, I didn't look it up, I didn't do the math, but I would guess that more of the Korean patients that are in the SEER data come from our registry than any other registry. And Dr. Lee will explain a little bit more about that as we go forward. And just to be sure everyone understands what SEER is not the entire United States. It's called a snapshot of the United States. So there are 16 registries across the nation, and we collect our data in an identical fashion and combine it. It represents about 30% of the United States population. And so as was alluded to here previously, gastric cancer is not in the top 10 in the United States. You can see it's number 12 for males and number 17th for females. But this is what Dr. Wang was alluding to. Actually, in the 1930s, gastric cancer was the leading cause of cancer death in the United States. And you can see the rate for white men back in the 30s and 40s, and the incredible decline into the 1970s. I don't think there's any other cancer known to this country that has had such a dramatic change. And women have followed exactly the same pattern at a lower rate. On the right, it's just a more contemporary time period of 1975 to 2015. This just to show the trend continues, fortunately. And if we look at the ethnic distribution, this again is SEER data. This is a relatively unusual pattern. And what I mean by that is certainly in our Los Angeles SEER data, for most cancers, there are distinct and significantly different rates of whatever cancer for the four racial groups. They tend to all separate. And we don't see that here. We see the whites being much lower, the Asian and Pacific Islanders, blacks and Hispanics essentially being identical. And again, males on the left and females on the right. And so that is interesting to us as population scientists as to understand what that means. But actually to focus on the Asian American population, this is what is happening in our country from 1990 to 2010 in terms of the growth of this population. You can see that there's been a 150% increase in the US population. So this is not cancer, this is the actual census data of the United States. And you can see that the largest growth has been among Chinese, but you can see that the Koreans have more than doubled in that time period as well. And so this is what we spend an awful lot of our time looking at and publishing. And we see here, this now is Los Angeles County data. And Koreans are, in fact, certainly the highest rates. And these are time trends from 1976 to 2012. And so when we plot these time trends, we're always looking for curves to go this direction, and we're seeing the curves going that direction for all these populations, so that always is a good sign. But you just see this enormous disparity. You know, the space between the lines is a clear indicator of the disparities. And again, you see non-Latino whites being a much lower rate than the rest, and essentially identical pattern for Korean. I will draw your attention, as was pointed out earlier, Japanese tend to have the second highest rate as our Vietnamese population has grown. We're seeing they also are showing elevated rates. And Dr. Lee and I were just observing that we mentioned the 1930s, 1940s, when stomach cancer was the leading cause of cancer death in the United States. Koreans in Los Angeles County now have the same incidence rate as what whites had back then. So, great amount of progress among the white population. We need to do exactly the same thing for the Korean population, and you see the same, that it just coincidentally blacks now for males have about the same rate as whites did back in 1970s. So certainly an uneven pattern in what we're seeing here. And Dr. Lee will show us some additional detail and implications of our data.
Thank you, and let me continue. So we wanted to better understand the trends in Korean Americans and Japanese Americans, the two groups that had the highest stomach cancer incidence in the US, in LA County. Now using the data from the California Cancer Registry, the statewide California data. So the stomach cancer incidence in Korean Americans has declined over time, as in other race ethnic groups. But Korean Americans had about 5 times higher incidence compared to non-Hispanic whites throughout the years. And about half of the incidence in native Koreans. Now let's add the data on Japanese. South Korea and Japan are the countries reporting the highest stomach cancer incidence worldwide. And Japanese Americans, together with Vietnamese Americans, not shown here, have the second highest stomach cancer incidence in California. But there is a big gap between Korean Americans and Japanese Americans. And the incidence in Japanese Americans is actually much closer to the rate in non-Hispanic whites than to the rate in native Japanese. The same pattern is observed for women. And these observations are in line with the difference between these two groups in terms of their immigration history. So Japanese Americans have much longer immigration history than Korean Americans. And in California, about 70% of Japanese Americans are US-born, second, third, or even fourth generation immigrants. But it's different for Korean Americans. About 70% of Korean Americans were born in Korea. So it's the same 70%, but it's the opposite. So it's an interesting coincidence. And it has been well established that Asian immigrants experience changes in lifestyle and cancer incidence patterns after migration. And these changes are larger in the second generation. So now let's look at the stage distribution. So this graph shows the percentage of localized stage stomach cancer across race ethnic groups over time between 1988 and 2017 in California. Interestingly, the percentage of localized stage was higher in Korean Americans than all other race ethnic groups throughout the years, and the gap is widening. So just as an example, if we look at the most recent time period between 2013 and 2017, 42% of Korean American stomach cancer patients were diagnosed at localized stage. But the percentages for all other race ethnic groups were much lower, so about 30% and or below. As we'll learn in the next few hours, the percentages in Japan and Korea are much higher. So in Japan, 56% around 2006, and in Korea, 66% in 2014. And we know these two countries have national stomach cancer screening programs, but here in the US, we don't. An even more interesting pattern was found when we were using the data from the SEER. So within Korean Americans, the percentage of localized stage disease was higher in LA County than in other areas in California and outside of California. So 49, 41, and 36%. But there was no such difference in other race ethnic groups, so equally bad. Again, all these percentages are much lower than that in South Korea, which was 66% in 2014. As I said earlier, so Korea and Japan have national screening programs, and endoscopy screening is widely available. But here in the US, we don't. But LA County has the largest Korean community outside of Korea, and many Korean American patients in LA County have access to Korean American physicians who are likely to be more aware of this issue and more open to early and aggressive use of endoscopy. And in fact, there have been efforts led by Korean American physicians to increase public and physician awareness. So we believe that the aggressive endoscopy use led to earlier diagnosis in Korean Americans, particularly in LA County. But when looking at the percentage in South Korea, we also believe that this can be further improved and has to be expanded to other race ethnic groups. So now the 5-year survival rate across race ethnic group is as we would expect based on the stage distribution. So Korean Americans have a higher survival than all other race ethnic groups. So the other groups not shown here, like Hispanics and African Americans, have the same survival rates as in whites. And within Korean Americans, those in LA County have a higher survival rate than those in other areas in California or outside of California. And again, the percentage is much higher in native Koreans. So this is our last slide. So it shows time trends of stomach cancer mortality by race ethnicity in California. So between 1988 and 2015, the death rate due to stomach cancer has declined in all race ethnic groups. But still, there is more than 4-fold difference between Korean Americans and non-Hispanic whites, and more than 2-fold difference between other minority race ethnic groups and non-Hispanic whites. So even if it looks small, it's actually not. It's a pretty significant, large disparity. So in summary, we hope we consider insurance coverage for targeted screening very positively today. It is true that stomach cancer is not common in the US, but there are high-risk race ethnic groups. And there is already an example of targeted screening. So lung cancer screening for asymptomatic high-risk populations with heavy smoking history is covered by insurance companies and Medicare. So we believe it is time to consider insurance coverage of stomach cancer endoscopy screening for high-risk populations. So our acknowledgements to our colleagues at USC and LA County Cancer Registry Program. Thank you.